Yep.
Great. Zaakir, thank you so much for joining me for this interview to talk about your new book, a biography of Charles Sumner. So before we jump into the book, I just wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself. What brought you to Charles Sumner as a subject?
Thank you for having me, Jamel. My name is Zaakir Tameez. I graduated from the University of Virginia before going to law school at Yale. I
Wahoo!
wrote the book, Wahoo! I wrote the book at Yale, but my interest in history started at UVA. I was there in Charlottesville in August 2017 when neo-Nazis and neo-Confederates stormed our grounds and desecrated our grounds with anti-Semitic bile, with racist chants, and with their tiki torches. And at one point, these neo-Nazis converged at the statue of Thomas Jefferson, the founder of UVA. And the neo-Confederates wanted to, in some way, celebrate Jefferson as an icon of white supremacy, celebrate his legacy as a slaveholder. But a few of my classmates got to the Jefferson statue first, and they defended the Jefferson statue from these white supremacists. I think what they were doing was not saying that they value Jefferson necessarily, but I think they were suggesting that we have to take ownership of our history, because if we don't tell the stories of history, then we leave it to others, like the neo-Confederates, to do so. And I think that moment seared in my mind this interest in studying our past, because it's only through the past that we can understand our present moment. There are literally people in our country who want to take America back to the 1800s. I insist instead that we should learn from the 1800s.
So what brought you to Charles Sumner, who is, I think, a figure who nerds like myself and you might understand, not nerd, not in a pejorative sense, just like nerd in the sense of people who are well read in American history, are familiar with them, but he's not necessarily a popular figure, someone who like looms large in American popular memory. So what brought you from this interest in history sparked by the events at UVA to Charles Sumner, and specifically to wanting to take on the project of writing a biography of Sumner?
Yeah, so I never planned on writing a book. The project started in a class in law school where I was reading the brief filed by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP in Brown versus Board. And as I'm reading this brief, I stumble on the name of Charles Sumner, who is cited not once, not twice, but more than 40 times. And I'm amazed by this because I knew about Charles Sumner as a nerd, as this U.S. senator who had been caned on the Senate floor, as a prominent politician during the Civil War. What I did not know is that more than 100 years before Brown, Charles Sumner tried to integrate the schools of Boston in a case at the Massachusetts Supreme Court, where he argued that the equality provisions of the Massachusetts Constitution and the Declaration of Independence had to be implemented in law, such that there can be no separate schools. And Marshall took this argument to Charles Sumner's, cited it point by point, redeveloped it, and then said that it was, I'm paraphrasing here, but Marshall said that credit goes to Thomas Jefferson for saying all men are created equal. But it was none other than Charles Sumner who insisted that equality should be implemented in law. And given my own interest in Jefferson and at UVA, and my interest in the history of race and slavery in this country, I thought Charles Sumner's story needed to be told again. And I thought the story of him trying to integrate the schools of Boston was so important to our history. And the last major biography of Charles Sumner, 2 volumes in 1960 and 1970, devoted one mere paragraph to this groundbreaking case in the history of American law. And I felt, my God, this story has to be told again.
So tell us about the story. Tell us about Charles Sumner in Boston. Like where does he come from? Obviously, he's a
Yeah.
Bostonite, but what's his family background? What brings him to the place where he is fighting for integration in Boston schools in the 1850s?
So Charles Sumner grew up in a series of contradictions. I'll tell you just two. First, he's a third generation Harvard educated man. His father went to Harvard, his grandfather went to Harvard, and he went to Harvard. But he also grew up in poverty because his father was a bastard child of his grandfather, didn't have any of the wealth and privileges that came with that. And his father also was just a lawyer who was really bad at being a lawyer. He just couldn't seem to make any money. And so they grew up impoverished. His mom was a seamstress. And that leads to the second contradiction, which is that Sumner grew up in a predominantly African American neighborhood in Boston in the 1810s because his parents could not afford to live in any other part of town, and also because his father was a true racial egalitarian. He was known to tip his hat walking past black Bostonians. He always said that he wished for the day when blacks would be judges in Boston. He interestingly insisted on using the term people of color to
Interesting.
refer to his neighbors, which I thought of as a modern term,
Yeah.
but I see it in his diary. And so that was a term that he would use, Charles Sumner's father. Now, put all that aside, Charles Sumner grows up, goes to Harvard, goes to law school, is trained by Joseph Story, a prominent justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And as a result, he gets inculcated in a very conservative, aristocratic, academic environment. And his teachers wanted him to become a corporate lawyer. And that's what he does after law school. And yet, as he practices law with the merchant class of Boston, many of whom make their profits off of slavery, he still lives in his mother's home in the black part of town. And these contradictions are things that he wrestles with throughout his early adulthood.
How did his peers think of his closeness with black Bostonians?
So when he was a kid, he was bullied in school for coming from the black part of town. And the main bully, interestingly enough, was a young Wendell Phillips.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's really
Yep.
funny.
Right? So Wendell Phillips, for the nerds who don't know, is one of the leading American abolitionists, kind of the right-hand man to William Lloyd Garrison. But Phillips is a real Boston blue-blooded Brahmin. His father was the first mayor of the city. And Wendell Phillips, as a kid, was definitely a racist and definitely prejudicial. And he was kind of the alpha male of the school because of his privileges. And so he would bully Sumner. They went all the way through Boston Latin School. They went to Harvard College together. They didn't even become friends until law school.
That's really interesting. It kind of, I mean, it speaks to something, and this might be going a little bit ahead in Sumner's life, but it speaks to the small world that was the world of, abolitionism. Like everyone kind of knew each other and kind of ran in similar circles, covered the same kind of lecture circuits. And it wasn't, it makes total sense to me that Wendell Phillips and Charles Sumner would have been like young peers because they end up being adult peers with all these other
Right.
figures.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And this is a slight exaggeration, but I sometimes feel like Charles Sumner knew every single famous person of the 19th century. And through the book, it's just like through my own research, I just come across all these names like Alexis de Tocqueville, Charles Dickens, Ralph Waldo Emerson. I could go on, but they're all there. Like they all passed through Boston, or he knew them this part of his life or a different aspect. And it's crazy to think how small the country was at the time.
I want to ask you about how Sumner goes from corporate law to politics. But before then, how much of the book is just kind of a biography of Boston during this period as well? Boston being this really major American city, this center of commerce and political life.
Yeah, a good deal is exploring this environment in Boston, both white Boston and black Boston. So I'll talk about Black Boston first, then I'll tell you about White Boston. Black Boston is in many ways the cultural capital of Black America at the time. Sumner lived walking distance to the African Meeting House, which is one of the first black churches in the country. He's also walking distance to the Prince Hall Masons, the Black Freemason organization founded in Boston. And he's walking there's the African Mutual Aid Society, which was an organization of Black Bostonians who were supporting one another through times of hardship. And there are writers in this community like David Walker, probably the first abolitionist in American history, who wrote this famous tract against slavery, calling out white Americans for their hypocrisy in very stark language. All that's happening in this neighborhood that Sumner grew up in. And so I explore this environment of Black Boston, how it interacts with white abolitionist Boston. And then I explore the bigger picture of white Boston. White Boston is, in many ways, the cradle of American liberty. It's the place where the revolution really began. It's a place of intellectuals, thinkers, writers, new Americans, but also it's the merchant capital of the country, or perhaps second only to New York. And it's an industrial capital as well. Sumner becomes best friends with Henry Longfellow. Longfellow, this very famous American poet, probably the most published poet in America at the time when they get older. Longfellow's father-in-law was Nathan Appleton, who, as a young man, went to England, learned the ins and outs of the textile industry, came back to Boston, founded the textile industries in New England, and then goes to the South and formed relationships with Southern slavocrats to form the cotton trade between the South and the North in order to feed these textile mills that become one of the most booming industries in the country. And so that really highlights the contradictions of Boston here. Sumner's close to Longfellow, who's a poet and a beautiful writer, and then Longfellow's father-in-law is this giant textile magnate. And Sumner is wrestling with these very contradictory realities in this city at this time.
So how does Sumner go from practicing corporate law to politics? And does he enter politics as like an anti-slavery man, or does he go through a phase of not that being his focus? And I guess another kind of question to throw in the mix here is, Sumner is going into, if he's entering into politics as, a dedicated opponent of slavery, it's interesting that he's going into politics because he would have been right at the crux of this debate among abolitionists about whether or not politics is a vehicle for achieving their aims. The great debate between Douglas and Garrison is heating up in the late 1830s and the 1840s.
Right. So Wendell Phillips and other abolitionists, black and white, are trying to pull Charles Sumner into their movement. They recognized that he had a powerful intellect. He was soaring oratory. He was 6'4", which would have made him a formidable abolitionist.
Big dude.
Big dude, strong, loud, outspoken. And they must have recognized that growing up in the community that he did, in the private views he was expressing, that he was someone who could be recruited for the movement. And one of the first ways they tried to recruit him was through the law. Sumner was a student of Joseph Story, this titan of American law, who wrote the commentaries on the Constitution, probably the most famous treatise of constitutional law of all time. Sumner once called the commentaries a light law reading, an entertaining and informing book. It's not light or entertaining, or it is informing, but I wouldn't call it the other two things. And so they invited him to go to the Smith School, one of the first black schools in the country, nearby his home, and give a lecture to the community on constitutional law. He agrees, and interestingly, he dresses up in a full suit. And a white person had asked him why was he dressing up to speak to a black audience, and he said, that if I am to respect them, then if they are to respect themselves, then I must respect them. And he gives this lecture, and I saw the notes of his lecture, and they are so tone deaf. He's just getting into federalism and this and that, and even the rights he's describing are obviously effectually inapplicable to this community, which he doesn't even acknowledge, at least in the notes that I've seen. But he does go, and he goes dressed up, and he takes them seriously, and he gives this lecture. And over the next few years, abolitionists keep trying to pull him in different ways. But he wrestles with this because he's uncomfortable with the anti-constitutionalism of Garrison and Phillips. He once had these exchange of letters with Wendell Phillips, where Wendell Phillips is pointing out that the Constitution makes these compromises with slavery, right? Most famously, Phillips and Garrison said that the Constitution is a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Sumner, meanwhile, keeps defending the Constitution. He says that he knows of no Constitution anywhere that is morally perfect and that all have flaws. And he says that as a citizen who benefits from the Constitution, should I not use my views and my vote to influence it to make it better? So they have this debate, and it's fascinating because remember that Phillips and Sumner went to law school together. They had the same teacher. And now they're having this complex debate. But then around the same time, Sumner meets John Quincy Adams. They met by accident. John Quincy Adams had mistakenly thought that Sumner had been to Russia because Sumner's brother had gone to Russia. And so Sumner gets to Quincy, meets John Quincy Adams. They realize that Sumner's the wrong Sumner and that JQA wanted to meet someone else, but he's already there, and so they just get to talking. John Quincy Adams had for a while been proposing that the Constitution be amended to abolish slavery. And the idea of amending...
At this time, he's serving in the House, right?
Yes, at this time he is serving in the House. He's out of the presidency. He is an anti-slavery advocate of a kind. He's not quite an abolitionist, but he is very outraged at the suppression of abolitionism in the North. And Quincy Adams is suggesting an amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery, which is very provocative and also seemed very delusional. No one could have imagined that being something practical. Not unlike today, the idea of amending the Constitution seems just so out there.
Yeah.
But Adams was proposing it, and Adams conceived of the Constitution as a flawed document that failed the Declaration of Independence, which his own father, John Adams, helped to write. So Adams teaches Sumner to think of the Declaration as a promissory note, that when it said all men are created equal, the founders had made a pledge, and that pledge needed to be fulfilled. And the only way to bring the Constitution in line with the Declaration was to amend it. So when Sumner finally does begin entering into politics and into anti-slavery politics, in one of his first speeches at a Whig state convention in Massachusetts, he starts proposing the idea of an abolition amendment. And that was his way of bringing the moral fervor of Garrison and Phillips into the legalistic ideas that he had.
We've both alluded to it, so I think it might be worth unpacking. I know these days, whenever anyone thinks about being against slavery in this period, they think of everyone being an abolitionist. But that wasn't really the landscape of anti-slavery thinking at the time. Abolitionists were sort of on one end, but who were the other sort of non-abolitionist, anti-slavery groups?
Yeah, so there's a range of different attitudes here. Abolitionists are generally defined as people who demanded the unconditional, immediate, uncompensated elimination of slavery and then freedom and equality granted to Black Americans. It's a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of people, white people, who believed in abolitionism. Then you have a kind of general anti-slavery sentiment, which meant slavery is morally wrong. Maybe it should be abolished in the territories and permitted in the South. Maybe there should be gradual compensated abolition. Maybe there should just be the non-extension of slavery into new places. There's all kinds of different views here, and there's a whole range. And then there's the colonization movement. The colonization movement proposed abolishing slavery or winding it down over a period of time, and then effectively deporting formerly enslaved people, quote unquote, back to Africa. Colonization had mostly white supporters. There were some black supporters, particularly in the 1830s. They kind of die out over time because they probably realized that their fellow colonizers were extremely racist. But the colonization societies could not imagine whites and blacks living as equals in this country, or African Americans being a political body in this country. So their proposal was just to mass deport them back. Many abolitionists and anti-slavery politicians, interestingly, began at some point in the colonization movement. Sumner never did. He's one of the very few white abolitionists who never entertained the idea of colonization. And I think that roots back to his own childhood, seeing a free black community that, yes, was marginalized, yes, was persecuted, yes, was oppressed, but was also vibrant and full of life, and full of intellectual ideas, and full of people going to school and going to church. And so from a young age, he could imagine a different kind of world in which whites and blacks were both equally American.
Yeah, it seems that early experience really solidified in his mind that black Americans were not some foreign imposition, but very much part of the national community, even if their rights weren't fully equal.
Precisely. And once he gets into politics, he would continually point out that at the time of the founding, in 1789, when the Constitution is first ratified, in 11 of the 13 colonies, black men, at least on paper, could vote. Or perhaps black men with property.
Right.
Which is a really striking fact, I think, for most people who don't know much American history. Because we assume that black men didn't have the right to vote, couldn't own property, couldn't do anything until after the Civil War. But in fact, many of the rights that they did have at the time of the founding were taken away after the founding.
Right.
I believe in New Jersey and New York, it was only in the 1810s or 1820s when black men lost the right to vote.
There was the expansion of political rights for all white men kind of went hand in hand with their restriction from other groups. So that was sort of the paradox of Jacksonian democracy. It was that the country became more democratic for some, and then like far less democratic for others.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then I didn't get much into this, sadly, but there were many black veterans of the Revolutionary War in Boston, or their children. And Sumner probably knew many of them, or at least he would have known that there were many black people who fought during the Revolution.
Right.
And so for him, this idea of black citizenship was very, very natural to him. It wasn't something alien or something that was bizarre or like inconceivable.
Yeah. So let's move. I feel like we're like in Sumner's like early political career. Let's talk about how he gets to Washington. Like, how does he get to the U.S. Senate, where he kind of makes his political name, makes his name as like a major figure?
Yeah. So in 1849, Sumner is a corporate lawyer, and a young black lawyer comes to him and named Robert Morris. And Morris asked Sumner to join him on a case to integrate the schools of Boston. This is the case I referred to earlier, and it's amazing because the idea of using litigation to advance school integration came from this young black attorney named Robert Morris. It did not come from Sumner, who simply joined on the case. Now, how did Sumner and Morris know each other? They served together on the Boston Vigilance Committee, which was an organization that Sumner helped to create. That was a collaboration between lawyers and activists to protect black Bostonians from being re-enslaved. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, Congress had essentially authorized bounty hunters to come to the North, abduct either runaways from slavery or just free people, and accuse them of being runaways from slavery. And they would be sent to a magistrate. The magistrate would get paid $5 for giving them freedom, $10 for sending them into slavery. So Sumner is horrified by this law, what he calls the most cruel, unchristian, devilish law. It gets him really involved in the thick of the action. So he is helping to defend suspected fugitives from being reabducted. He is representing them in court. He is doing this, doing that with Morris and others. And he is also trying to figure out how to get this law overturned in Congress in the future. Now, this is, again, very hard to conceive. Sumner's a dreamer. And he sets out on a mission to try to get an anti-slavery politician to succeed Daniel Webster, the famous Webster of Massachusetts, who was in the U.S. Senate, who had endorsed the Fugitive Slave Act. When Webster is appointed Secretary of State, there is now an opening for that Senate seat. Robert Winthrop is appointed to be there for about a year and a half before the election, and as that election is approaching, Sumner knows that the Massachusetts legislature will decide on who is the next senator, because back then legislatures decided senators rather than the public. And Sumner is now organizing with the Free Soil Party. This is a party that stands for the opposition to slavery in the Western territories. Again, like we were talking about, that's closer to the quote-unquote middle of the anti-slavery spectrum. Sumner's campaigning with the Free Soilers. The Free Soilers win a handful of seats in the Massachusetts legislature. Not a majority, just a small number of seats, but it's enough to deprive the Whigs and the Democrats of a majority, which means one of those two parties needs to form a coalition with the Free Soilers. And the Free Soilers present an offer to the Democrats that in exchange for voting with the Democrats within the state, the Democrats would give the Free Soilers a seat in the U.S. Senate. And next thing you know, Sumner is elected to the U.S. Senate on this Free Soil platform.
So he's elected as a Free Soiler.
Yes.
Interesting. And so that's what, 1852?
1851.
1851. Okay. And that begins his Senate career. And I think to the extent that anyone knows about Charles Sumner, it's sort of Sumner in the Senate, and specifically the confrontation with Preston Brooks a couple years later that they kind of know about. But could you walk through sort of Sumner's first years in the Senate?
Yeah, so Sumner gets to the Senate, and he is full of lofty ideas about what the Senate is going to be like. Sumner went to the Boston Latin School. He had been reading about the Roman Senate all his life, and he probably imagined something very similar when he gets to Washington. And in some ways, the Senate does reflect that Roman ideal. It's a gorgeous space, a semicircle room with these thick crimson carpets, mahogany desk, a beautiful vaulted ceiling. The senators are known for their booming oratory. The Senate is a place of very vibrant debate. In many ways, the Senate is the most powerful institution in America at the time. Throughout the 1840s and 50s, even today we can notice that the household names from that era are Webster, Calhoun, Clay, maybe Sumner. And they're in many ways more important and powerful than presidents like Pierce, Fillmore, etc. So Sumner gets there, and probably one of the first things that he would notice is that the floor is covered in tobacco spit, because senators were known to spit tobacco directly onto the floor, even though there were spittoons available everywhere. They would spit on the floor because they could. Charles Dickens once visited the Senate, and he said that if anyone goes to the Senate, don't look down. On top of that, there is a lot of machismo behavior. Within the first few weeks, he sees senators almost getting into brawls and threatening each other. He sees senators getting drunk, often by the afternoon. A lot of the committee rooms had free liquor. And he's coming in from Puritan New England. So he's horrified by all this, very uncomfortable by it. He's prudish by nature. And he would later describe these kinds of behaviors as, quote, plantation manners. Although they did apply to many Northerners, Sumner perceived it as all arising from this Southern, quote-unquote, gentlemanly behavior. He is warned within days of arriving by a colleague that at Washington, slavery rules everything. And he notices this over time. Anyone who was being appointed to a cabinet position or to any position that the Senate had to confirm would be asked about their opinions on slavery. all committee chairs in Washington are being selected, would not have been selected if they had anti-slavery political positions. The leading members of the Senate are all sort of coordinating to ensure that slavery is expanding within the Southwest. And Sumner is appalled and deeply disturbed by this. At the same time, he is still navigating how to speak out against it. So for the first 2 years, he is becoming friends with as many people as he can. He is going to a lot of parties in Washington. Washington is a Southern slave city, and so he's being exposed to Southern culture. He interestingly befriends Jefferson Davis's wife.
Oh.
In Washington at the time. And even writing many decades later, in like I think the 1880s or 90s, Jefferson Davis's wife, after the Civil War, remembers Sumner fondly because Sumner would talk to her, for hours about dance and about laces and about dresses and the history of this and the Romans and the Greeks. And Sumner was a big yapper. And so anyone who liked to listen just enjoyed his company.
That's this is maybe a little later in the story, but I know he was close to Mary Todd Lincoln, and it sounds like a very similar kind of relationship.
Exactly. He was really close to Mary Todd Lincoln, who also just enjoyed, they would speak in French together because Mary Todd has studied French and Sumner is one of the only people in Washington who was fluent in the language. And so he often had these kind of interesting pairings with women, leading women in Washington society.
But so he's navigating sort of the Senate, making friends, trying to, get his bearings. When does he give his first speech? Sumner being known for his oratory. When is his first real address to the Senate, and what is he tackling in that first address?
Yeah, so for the first 2 years, Sumner is getting a lot of pressure from his abolitionist and anti-slavery constituents to speak out and to make a bold anti-slavery speech. And he is getting his base, so to speak, is furious with him for remaining relatively silent at first. Sumner keeps writing to constituents saying, you need to be patient with me. I need time. I don't want to just become labeled the radical senator who won't have credibility with my colleagues. And meanwhile, folks in Boston are furious with him because they're afraid he's selling out. Theodore Parker, this abolitionist reverend in Boston, writes to Sumner and says, I expect you to be the senator with a conscience. I expect heroism of the heroic kind from you. When Sumner is not meeting that expectation, Parker writes to Sumner's best friend and tells him to tell Sumner that he needs to speak, otherwise he is dead, dead, dead. So he's getting this pressure for a while. Eventually Sumner decides that it's finally time to give a speech. And he makes the mistake of telling colleagues that he plans to give a major anti-slavery speech. It's just classic rookie behavior, right? like you don't tell your opponents your play. And so naturally, when he tries to give the speech, other senators stop him using various procedural rules. And for a while, Sumner's getting really anxious because if he can't get the floor to speak before the end of that first 2 years, he's going to go home to Boston and they're going to hate him. So he keeps the speech in his desk. And at some point he learns that if he speaks on an amendment to the budget bill, that he will have the floor for as long as he wants. So when the budget bill is coming up for a vote, Sumner decides that that's the moment he's going to speak, connecting it to the fact that the budget bill is going to include appropriations to commissioners who are participating in the abduction of fugitive slaves. And so he's ostensibly giving a speech against the Fugitive Slave Act. The speech is called Freedom National, Slavery Sectional. He gets up, claims the floor, boasts that nobody can now stop him, and then he delivers this major anti-slavery speech, almost entirely from memory. It's several hours long, probably close to 100 pages. And he lays out a theory that he adopted in part from his colleague Sammon Chase, who you and I know about.
Yeah. And Sammon Chase, as a quick sidebar, Sammon Chase being a prominent Ohio anti-slavery politician, longtime presidential contender under various tickets, and would serve as Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury and then Chief Justice of the United States.
So Chase is a brilliant lawyer, not as good of an orator. And that is where Charles Sumner thrives. So Charles Sumner takes Chase's ideas and gives them a pithy, easy way for people to understand. He argues that under the national flag, there is no such thing as slavery. Slavery can only exist at the state level. Now, what's the evidence for this? He points out that the Constitution never uses the word slavery. James Madison famously said in Diary that he did not want to admit the idea of, quote, property in man in the Constitution, which is why they use euphemisms. Sumner points out that at the time of the founding, there was no territory that had slavery. It was only after the founding that slavery was established in Washington, D.C. But in fact, for the first couple of years, there was no slavery in national territories. The first territories incorporated into the country in the Northwest were all free territories. And then Sumner also points out that slavery had never been recognized at the national level. Now, he does something really interesting here, which is that he's making this constitutional argument that slavery is unconstitutional in territories because it has no national recognition. Then he says that every word of the Constitution must be construed in favor of liberty. He's drawing from a common law principle that you must interpret the law in favor of the value of liberty. And so unless there is an explicit positive language in the Constitution establishing slavery in territories, the default is that there cannot be slavery in territories because slavery is a violation of natural liberties. When he makes this argument, he continues to invoke the Founding Fathers. He says that he is going to look at the practices of the Founding Fathers, the intentions of the Founding Fathers, the words of the Founding Fathers, and he goes on and on. While preparing for the speech, he wrote to his buddy, Charles Francis Adams, and asked him if he had any private letters of his grandfather against slavery, grandfather being John Adams. And he makes these very bold arguments about why the Founding Fathers, in his view, are anti-slavery at the federal level, even if they permitted slavery at the state level. So, for example, George Washington was a slaveholder, owned many slaves, was a brutal enslaver in many respects. And many pro-slavery advocates would point out that how can slavery be wrong if George Washington was a slaveholder himself? And Sumner responds and says, points out that George Washington emancipated his slaves in his will. And to Sumner, that means that George Washington on earth was a slaveholder, but George Washington went to heaven as an abolitionist. And he says, from Washington on earth, I appeal to Washington from heaven. He points out that Jefferson is a brutal enslaver, but Jefferson wrote the words, all men are created equal. And so Sumner said that Jefferson was effectively temporally a slaveholder, but achieved immortality as an emancipator. So he uses this rhetoric. He has this very different idea of who the Founding Fathers were. He's also interestingly embracing the founding project rather than rejecting it in the ways that some abolitionists were doing so. And this whole approach is particularly novel and very disarming for his opponents who were just unprepared to react to a speech like that.
It's interesting to see, as far back as then, this approach, and Frederick Douglass utilizes it as well. Sort of this emerging group of political anti-slavery figures are embracing this approach of really kind of cloaking themselves in the flag, in the founders, in the Constitution to make their case. And
right.
It's a testament to its effectiveness, right? That in a lot of ways their political and intellectual descendants, the civil rights movement activists, do the exact same thing.
Yep.
Basically adopt the exact same strategy for making their rhetorical appeals. It's just an observation.
Yeah, no, it's very apt because Sumner was frustrated with abolitionists who continued to denounce the Constitution. Garrison, for example, on July 4th, one year, while standing on stage with Sojourner Truth and Henry David Thoreau, took a copy of the Constitution and lit it on fire. So Sumner was very disturbed by this approach. He believed in that strategically and morally was better to embrace the American project. But at the same time, he doesn't reject his more radical, quote unquote, allies. They're
Right.
working in concert for the same political objectives, even if they have a different conception of America writ large.
Right. Around this time, sort of in American politics, the Republican Party is taking shape. So Sumner becomes a Republican. Does he find himself in the Republican Party as sort of a founding member, or is he kind of someone who joins the Republican project after it's been more or less established?
He's one of the founders
Yeah.
of the Republican Party. The Republican Party was organized at the grassroots, so there's no founding charter of the Republicans that names the signatories at the bottom, right?
Right.
But insofar as there are founders of the Republican Party, he's definitely on that list. And after the caning, which we may talk about in a moment, the Republicans embraced Sumner as one of their mascots, so to speak. At the first RNC, the first Republican National Convention in 1856, they are literally chanting Charles Sumner's name in unison. The Republicans print Sumner's speech, The Crime Against Kansas. As many as 3 million copies are printed by the Republican Party. He's very much one of the first Republicans and one of the symbolic founders of the Republicans.
Can you talk a little about Sumner in the lead up to the secession crisis? And mainly, I mean, let's go into the big event of his life in this period, which is he's attacked by Preston Brooks, a Democratic member of the House from South Carolina. So can you talk a little bit about the confrontation with Brooks and then like how that kind of plays out in Sumner's political life for the next couple years?
Yeah, so let me paint a picture of America by 1856. By this time, there are more than 4 million enslaved people in the South. Roughly 1/4 of the Southern population is enslaved. Slaveholders are terrified of domestic rebellion. And as part of that, they are seeking to suppress abolitionist dissent by any means necessary. There are many Southern states where you could get the death penalty for helping a slave escape, even if you're a white person. Southern states were monitoring the mail for any anti-slavery sentiment, which was criminalized. All this comes to fore in the territory of Kansas. Kansas is a territory straddling between North and South. Congress had passed this Kansas-Nebraska Act 2 years later, essentially allowing the territory to have a vote on whether it would become a slave state or a free state. White men are going to vote on whether to enslave the black population of Kansas. Slaveholders are desperate to make sure that Kansas becomes a slave state. So much so that Sumner had a former colleague named David Atchison. He's the former president pro tem of the Senate, a senator from Missouri. Atchison goes back to Missouri, organizes a gang of more than 1,000 men. They storm into Kansas, take over polling locations at gunpoint, stuff the ballots, and force voters to vote in favor of slavery. And Atchison tells his thugs that if we can get slavery in Kansas, we can spread it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, in Washington, a slave city, many of Sumner's anti-slavery colleagues are nervous to speak out against this terrible threat to democracy. They themselves are getting harassed and accosted on the streets. They knew that there were consequences to speaking out against slavery, particularly if they spoke out in very strong language. If they were muted and quiet about it, they were safe. If they spoke out strongly, they themselves were at risk of attack. Because Southern slaveocrats in Washington followed the same social mores of South Carolina and Georgia, which is that if you spoke against slavery, you would get hurt. In this context, Sumner decides, after some thinking it over, that he needs to speak out. That if no one else will, he will do so. And Sumner doesn't know moderation. If he's going to speak out, he's going to go all out. He writes to a friend and he says that he will deliver the most thorough philippic ever uttered in a legislative body. A philippic being a really insulting speech. He calls it The Crime Against Kansas, where he denounces the crisis in Kansas as a, quote, rape of a virgin territory. Then he starts to single out his colleagues. He describes David Acheson, the senator who helped to orchestrate the crisis in Kansas, as a Roman traitor, comparing him to a Roman traitor who had been hung for treason. He compares President Pierce to a Roman dictator. He basically calls Stephen Douglas Lucifer incarnate. And then he targets Senator Andrew Pickens Butler of South Carolina. Butler is a slaveholder. Butler also has a speech impediment because he was recovering from a stroke. So Sumner naturally makes fun of his speech impediment, makes fun of Butler's hair, makes fun of Butler's home state by saying the state of South Carolina could be blotted out of existence and civilization would look the same. And then he targets Butler by saying that Butler had a mistress, pure in his sight, but ugly in the sight of the world, the harlot slavery. What Sumner is doing is he's pointing out the reality that Southern slaveholders were often engaging in rape. I found evidence that's not been reported in any previous Sumner biography that one of Butler's former slaves was interviewed in the 1930s, many decades later, and that enslaved person, now free, recalled that Butler did in fact have a quote-unquote mistress and sired 2 children by her, probably an enslaved quote-unquote mistress. So Sumner is telling the world about Butler's activities, as he's also pointing out this anti-democratic, treasonous activity in Kansas. The Senate is appalled by this speech. One senator said that Butler should come back and basically beat the crap out of Sumner. A congressman says that Sumner should be hung. Stephen Douglas said on the Senate floor that does Sumner want a colleague to kick him like a dog on the street. And there's this tension in the atmosphere because people know that violence is possible at this point. Sumner, I argue, saw this coming. He knew that he was putting himself at risk, and he did so anyway because he saw the political utility for the anti-slavery movement if an incident ended up occurring. And sure enough, Butler's nephew, a congressman from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, approaches Sumner on the Senate floor 2 days later. He comes with 2 colleagues, also from South Carolina. One of them brandishes a cane and possibly a gun to make sure nobody intervenes. And Brooks approaches Sumner from the front with a gutta-percha gold-tipped cane and starts beating him over the head. The cane shatters within just a few beatings. Eventually Sumner gets up, Brooks pulls him close and just starts beating him over and over and over again. Someone else eventually grabs Brooks and pulls him back and says, "You're going to kill him, you're going to kill him." And Brooks responds, "I do not intend to kill him. I only intend to flog him." For the next few weeks, a lot of Southern papers are using the language of flogging and whipping to describe what happened to Sumner. One Southern newspaper said that Sumner was beaten because he represented the, quote, sentiments of a Negro, forgive the language. Brooks defends himself afterwards by basically saying on the House floor that he had a right to beat Sumner just as he has a right to whip his own slaves on his plantation. And the North is appalled by seeing this outpouring of violence and the celebration of violence by the South. The South sees it as a necessary act to, quote-unquote, discipline the abolitionist agitators of the North and show them who's boss.
So, in the wake of Sumner's beating, this really does galvanize a Northern public, and it seems to contribute to the kinds of tensions that would explode a couple years later with the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott, at which Sumner was a very vocal critic. If you could talk a little bit about that. Yeah,
so in the aftermath of the caning, the North is very galvanized. Frederick Douglass said no one act did more to rouse the North to anti-slavery sentiment. There are tens of thousands of Northerners gathering in what they called indignation meetings to lament over the caning and to organize action afterwards. It's really an organic, grassroots Republican agenda, Republican program. that emerges across the North. And then a few years later, Sumner is recovering. He spends a lot of time in Europe. And on his second trip to Europe while he's recovering from the caning, literally the day that he leaves, the newspapers publish Dred Scott. Sumner, I think luckily for his own mental health, did not know about it until after he got to London. And he is horrified by this. Dred Scott, written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, basically said that blacks cannot be citizens of the United States, and they are not entitled to any rights, quote unquote, which the white man is bound to respect. Taney makes this argument, also relying on, quote unquote, historical interpretation like Sumner, and says that the founders only believed that white men were entitled to rights under the Constitution. Basically the opposite of what Sumner had been saying. Sumner was disturbed by it. He was also not impressed by it. He had met Taney before and was horrified to see how small Taney's library was. Considering that you're Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, you would probably own a lot of books. Taney did not. And Sumner, for the rest of his life, argues for a very limited Supreme Court. He says later on that the Supreme Court is not arbiter of the acts of Congress. He also says that the Supreme Court, he thinks that the Supreme Court should not be overturning acts of legislation. Dred Scott is the first time in nearly 50 years the Supreme Court had overturned an act of Congress. The first time being Marbury versus Madison. To Sumner, Dred Scott is both horrifying and is legally incorrect. It is also a significant overreach of the court's powers, and for the rest of his life, he is trying to cabin the court to not be so powerful because he fears that it's an anti-democratic institution. And interestingly, when Roger Taney ultimately dies while Lincoln is president, Sumner tells Lincoln this is a day to celebrate, which is celebrate the death of the Supreme Court justice rather than mourn. And then he pushes to make sure that Taney does not receive a bust in the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's only decades later that Congress authorized a bust of Roger Taney that was there until very recently.
How is... Sorry. We're going to fast forward a little bit through some history, but I'm kind of curious about, Sumner's relationship with Lincoln, Sumner during the Civil War. What is he... How does he view his role? I'll ask it that way. How does he view his role during the war? How does he view his relationship with Lincoln? What are his aims during this really kind of critical period of his life, to say nothing of the nation's history?
So on the day that Fort Sumter is bombed, this is the first battle of the Civil War, Sumner goes to the White House, goes to Abraham Lincoln, and basically says, this is amazing. This is great news. And he tells Lincoln that now Lincoln can use his war powers to emancipate Southern slaves. The idea of wartime emancipation came into Sumner's life from John Quincy Adams, who had proposed the same thing decades earlier, warning the South that if there is one day a civil war, a servile war, some kind of war, then the president has new powers not granted in peacetime, including the confiscation of property of the enemy. So here Sumner sees the possibility of Lincoln issuing an executive order claiming the property of the enemy, which in this case is the newly created Confederacy, and then emancipating that property to lead to freedom for Southern enslaved people. And Lincoln doesn't quite like this idea. He's not convinced by it, but they argue about it until midnight. And for the next few months, Sumner would go to Lincoln and they would just argue and argue and argue. But the fact that Lincoln continued to argue with Sumner indicated that he took the idea very seriously and that he was slowly warming up to it. Lincoln later on tells Sumner that you and I agree we're only 6 weeks apart. It's more than 6 weeks. But Sumner, for a long time, assures Lincoln that he will not speak out publicly against the administration because he had this private faith that Lincoln was on the right track, even if he was slow to walk it. Eventually, Sumner does break that, and he starts to speak out very openly in public, demanding that Lincoln sign this order. Sumner had very interesting opinions about Lincoln. He thought Lincoln was completely unprepared for the job. He saw Lincoln as totally, not totally inept, but fairly inept. Lincoln is this folksy guy from Illinois who had grown up in Kentucky. Lincoln spoke only one language. Charles Sumner spoke six. Lincoln had never traveled outside the United States. Sumner had been all across Europe. Lincoln was a self-trained lawyer. Sumner went to Harvard. So they had all these very big differences. But at the same time, Sumner saw Lincoln had the capacity to achieve greatness. In 1861, in October and November, it was very early in the war, Sumner says that Lincoln could go down in history as a hero like Columbus and Washington because he was presiding over the third great epoch on the American continent. The first being the quote-unquote discovery, the second being the founding, the third now being the Civil War. And Sumner says that Lincoln could be a great emancipator and go down for all time if he issues an Emancipation Proclamation. And amazingly, he does use that exact phrase of Emancipation Proclamation in 1861. When Lincoln does sign the Emancipation Proclamation, Sumner helps to revise the last sentence, and then Lincoln hands him the pen afterwards, which Sumner took to Boston, and now it's at a museum.
So, okay. Post the Emancipation Proclamation, as we get through 1864, the Lincoln administration is beginning to think more about what to do about former rebel states. Thinking about what that post-war period is going to look like. And this is when, scholars of Reconstruction will say you really have to start thinking about Reconstruction beginning in this period. Where is Sumner in all of this? How is Sumner thinking about the after the war? War is not over, but is he thinking about what the post-war is going to look like and what needs to be done?
So Sumner writes an article laying out his theory of Reconstruction in 1862, like way before anyone else was even thinking about it. And then in fact, he doesn't publish it because he notices that the country's not quite there yet and waits a little bit longer before it gets published in the Atlantic. And in that article, Sumner basically lays out this theory that Southern states had committed suicide. It's called the state suicide theory. The logic here being that when Southern states decided to rebel against the national government, they had effectively killed themselves as legal entities. And now those Southern states had reverted into a territorial status, which means that Congress has plenary power over them. Sumner emphasizes that Congress should play the key role in these states after the war. And what should Congress do? Sumner argues that Congress should require Southern states to permit black men to vote, formerly enslaved people. It should have new constitutional conventions where blacks could participate and draft new constitutions. Sumner wanted to add certain provisions to this. He wanted to require mandatory public schools across the South. He wanted to ensure the voting rights, of course. He also wanted there to be mass land redistribution. He said, shatter the plantations and give the pieces to the slaves. He plays a role both in public and also behind the scenes. One of his closest proteges, a man named Edward Pierce, goes to the Sea Islands to see the experiment in land redistribution that famously went on there. And Pierce writes a report back to the federal government that Sumner widely circulates. He's also working with Carl Schurz, who writes a similar report, and he's working with the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, which writes another similar report, and all these reports talk about land reform, in addition to voting rights, in addition to public schools. And so Sumner is kind of everywhere, laying seeds for what he thinks Reconstruction should be, and he starts very early and presciently.
The war ends. Lincoln is assassinated. Congress passes the 13th Amendment, or the states ratify it later that year. And we're kind of into Reconstruction proper. President Johnson is really resisting Congress. Can you speak a little about Sumner during this period of presidential Reconstruction and then speak a little about how how his role develops, what path he takes when Congress reasserts itself, a year later or so.
Yeah. So Sumner's there when Lincoln dies. He's actually holding Lincoln's hand. He had heard about the possible shooting. He ran to the White House where he found Robert Todd Lincoln, who didn't know anything. And together they go to Ford's Theater and then across the street to the house where Lincoln is in his room. And Sumner's there until 7 in the morning, holding Lincoln's hand, sobbing as Lincoln dies. He goes home later that day. He's having breakfast, and a lot of people are visiting him because they're worried that he might have been killed too, because there wasn't, smartphones back then. Nobody knew exactly what happened, who had been
Right.
killed, who had not been. Seward had been attacked. People wondered if Sumner had been attacked. And Sumner slumped over the breakfast table, and a visitor is relieved to know that he's alive, and asks him, "What are we going to do now that our leaders are gone?" And Sumner goes, "Our leaders are gone, but the Republic remains." He meets Andrew Johnson. At first, Johnson is pleasing to Sumner. Johnson seems to be open to black suffrage and to a radical Reconstruction program. Johnson had this deep hatred towards rich, white Southern slavocrats. And so Sumner confuses that hatred for wealthy aristocrats in the South to being empathy for enslaved people, who Johnson
Right.
literally could not care less about.
A lot of people make this mistake.
Right, exactly.
Douglas famously makes this mistake.
Yeah. So after a few months, when Johnson clearly is pursuing this completely different program, right, of granting amnesty to ordinary Confederates, even if he's punishing the leading rebels, and Johnson is not promoting black suffrage at all, Sumner comes back to Johnson in the fall and just starts screaming at him. At some point, Johnson spits into Sumner's hat, probably on accident, but maybe not. Johnson had a colleague who was there, a congressman from the South, who said that Sumner was crying big crocodile tears for the Negro. Again, forgive the language, that's a direct quote. And Sumner then basically he never goes back to Johnson again, and he starts openly calling for the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Others are trying to work with Johnson, hoping he'll come around. Many leading Republicans feel awkward about this whole situation because Johnson is ostensibly a member of their party, and they're trying to work with Johnson. But after Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the Freedmen's Bureau Act, then Republicans start to realize that Johnson is never going to work with them. Meanwhile, Sumner proved very prescient because pretty much from the get-go, from that fall of 1865, Sumner is saying that Johnson can't be trusted. Eventually, Congress does move to impeach Johnson based on alleged violations of the Office of Tenure Act, and Sumner is furious with his colleagues for making it into a whole legal proceeding. He's very openly saying, no, we're going to impeach him because his politics are bad.
Yeah.
And while that's not successful, what is successful is Sumner helps to secure a Republican supermajority in Congress such that they can pass legislation that overrides Johnson's veto.
We're kind of I want to start leading us to wrapping up a bit. So I'm trying to think of where to go with this. Sumner is, throughout this period, remains a huge advocate for equal rights, for kind of an expansive vision of what the Constitution provides. He is, if I understand this correctly, right, he is not like an author of the 14th Amendment, but certainly a major advocate for some of the key parts of the 14th, and then also for the 15th Amendment and its constitutional protection of voting rights.
So Sumner is interesting because he believed the 13th Amendment did everything that Congress needed.
Right.
He put a lot of emphasis in the second clause of the 13th Amendment, which basically said that Congress shall pass any legislation to enforce, any appropriate legislation to enforce the meaning of this amendment. And to Sumner, this enforcement clause essentially authorized Congress to do it all, to secure equality, to secure voting rights, to secure birthright citizenship. These were all things that Sumner believed could happen by statute now that the 13th Amendment had passed.
And the theory being that abolishing slavery wasn't just about ending the literal,
Exactly.
legal relationship, but everything surrounding slavery as an institution.
The theory that everything surrounding slavery as an institution should be abolished permanently, and the theory that Congress had the right to interpret what the abolition of slavery constituted.
Right.
He did not think the court should later prescribe what is and is not the abolition of slavery. He thought Congress could do it on its own, and the court should defer to Congress's judgment. Now, this all comes to the fore by 1870. By this time, Sumner is very close to a number of black middle-class entrepreneurs and businessmen in Washington, D.C., who are pointing out to him that yes, slavery has been abolished, yes, there's birthright citizenship, yes, black men have the right to vote, but they're still shut out of common schools. They're shut out of the rail car. They can't get into the same hotels as a white person. They're still effectively relegated to a second-class citizenship status. So Sumner collaborates with a black law professor named John Mercer Langston. He tells Langston to write up a bill that would effectively be a national integration bill, a bill that would create a right of public accommodation for anyone to get on a common carrier regardless of race. Langston writes the bill for Sumner. Sumner introduces it to the Senate. Some Republicans are saying that this bill goes too far, that it infringes on state rights. And Sumner responds to one of his colleagues and says, quote, "You are referring to the old method of constitutional interpretation. I am referring to the method that was conquered at Appomattox." Appomattox being the last battle of the Civil War. He says there is now, quote, "a new rule of interpretation where every line, every word of the Constitution is to be construed uniformly and thoroughly for human rights." So he believed in a visionary, expansive human rights constitutionalism that he thought resided in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and also just resided from the nature of the Civil War itself. The war had transformed the law. He said the greatest victory of the war was the emancipation of the Constitution. And that's what he uses to kind of explore this like bigger project of securing equality in all aspects of public life after the Civil War.
Sorry. So if I remember this correctly, this bill, which becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1875, really is a kind of precursor to what would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Like it's remarkably similar to see the same calls for non-discrimination and public accommodations only almost 100 years prior to the 64 Act.
Yeah, I mean, I got goosebumps when I looked up the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and read the first two provisions, because those two provisions are basically verbatim what Charles Sumner had introduced in 1870, and verbatim of what Langston, this black law professor who has been mostly forgotten today, wrote in his original draft. So much of modern civil rights law was written by Sumner and Langston nearly 100 years earlier. They created the blueprint.
It's really interesting to think about these partnerships Sumner had with black lawyers. I mean, it speaks both to the relationship Sumner had with black Americans in Boston, but sort of it also speaks to, I think, something that isn't as appreciated in the present, the real impact that black Americans as legal thinkers had on the legal and constitutional debate kind of surrounding the Civil War, both before and after.
So what's really incredible is not Sumner's relationship with black lawyers, but black businessmen who had legal ideas.
Yeah.
He was very close to George Downing, who was a caterer, a restaurateur, and the head of the mess hall for the House of Representatives. So Downing is basically top chef on Capitol Hill. And Downing is furious with Republicans whose mouths he literally fed, who are refusing to endorse Sumner's civil rights bill. And so Downing writes these letters to Sumner where he is point by point debating constitutional ideas that moderate Republicans were proposing. And Sumner would read those letters on the Senate floor. And there's this one great quote where he says that I put Downing side by side with the senator from Maine and show that Downing is basically a better constitutional lawyer. So Sumner is not only working with black lawyers, he's working with ordinary black citizens and arguing that their interpretations of the Constitution are just as legitimate, if not more legitimate and more accurate than sitting United States senators.
So, can you talk a little bit about the end of Sumner's life and the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, which does happen in 1875, and kind of what the reaction was to Sumner's passing among Americans? And I'd be interested to know about among Black Americans as well.
Yeah. So in 1874, Sumner has a heart attack. One of the first people to get to his home is George Downing, who I just mentioned. And Downing is holding Sumner's hand and keep watch by the bedside as a huge flock of Washingtonians come to Sumner's home when they learn about what's going on in the morning. The Speaker of the House, James Blaine, is in the room. Carl Schurz is in the room, another leading U.S. senator. Many diplomats are there. Frederick Douglass arrives, and they're all in Sumner's home while Sumner lies dying. In another room, the library next door, the Senate chaplain is there reading prayers to a group of members of Congress who had literally walked from Capitol Hill 40 minutes all the way to Sumner's house. Congress adjourned when they learned that Sumner was dying, just so that people could go to his home. And in fact, many people were getting up before the official adjournment just to come to Sumner's home. As he's dying, he is high off his mind with morphine. And he's constantly trying to get up. And Downing, among others, is holding him down to prevent him from getting up. And then he says to his secretary, the bill, take care of the bill. And his secretary says, don't worry, we'll pay your household bills. You're not going to die in debt, like I got you. And Sumner responds and says, no, you don't understand me. Take care of my civil rights bill. Don't let the civil rights bill fail. And that's when Downing and others realized that Sumner was trying to get up because he was trying to go to the Senate to work on the civil rights bill. Downing recalled that on another day, Sumner had told him, this is while Sumner is suffering from angina and other heart pain, and Sumner told Downing that prostrate as I am, could I crawl to the Capitol and pass the civil rights bill, I would, before I died. And so Sumner is trying to get up. He's telling people, take care of the civil rights bill, don't let the bill fail. Everyone is crying at this point. And then Sumner dies. Frederick Douglass writes down on a note card Sumner's final words, don't let the civil rights bill fail. And that note card is still in the Library of Congress. When Sumner he first lies in state in Abraham Lincoln's catafalque in the U.S. Senate, the first senator to do so. Then he's taken up by train to Boston, his home. He lies in state at the Massachusetts state capitol. Tens of thousands of people visit Sumner's casket, and it is very decorated. People are leaving all kinds of tributes to Sumner. And George Downing's brother, Peter Downing, from Brooklyn, goes up to Boston and sets up these blue violets on Sumner's casket and spells out with white carnations, do not let the civil rights bill fail. And there's a Harper's Weekly printed a drawing of Sumner's casket with this floral shield that says, do not let the civil rights bill fail. Tens of thousands, perhaps millions of people see this drawing in Harper's Weekly. And then Frederick Douglass, Downing, Langston, and others lead a campaign to pass the civil rights bill in Charles Sumner's honor. The Senate passes the bill 3 months later. The House did not pass it till the following year, whittling it down significantly. It does become law, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, but 8 years later, the Supreme Court, which Sumner believed had no right to do this, overturns the law in the civil rights cases. And within a few years after that, you saw the rise of Jim Crow, which would have been effectively illegal under Sumner's bill. And it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that this idea of a right to public accommodation was nationally authorized again.
there's another bit of interesting symmetry just in that the 64 Civil Rights Act is spurred on by Kennedy's assassination.
Right.
Just the death of these figures providing the fuel for the passage of these laws. I don't think there's anywhere to go with that. It's just like an interesting,
Yeah.
you know.
No, it's
Interesting bit of
interesting, and I
symmetry.
think like Sumner, at some deep innate level, was a politician who understood these kinds of moments. Like
Yeah.
after the caning, one of the first things Sumner does, like literally while he's still there, he's still bloody. He saw a doctor, then he sees a reporter, and
Yeah.
he basically tells the reporter what happened to him. When Lincoln dies, Sumner uses Lincoln's death to push for black suffrage, and now at his own dying, while he's high off morphine, he's probably at some very deep innate level recognizing that if he keeps saying civil rights bill, the bill, the bill, the bill, that it might inspire a movement after his passing.
Yeah. A very astute politician. I wanna wrap up by just asking, you know, we've walked through Sumner's life. I want to ask you, what do you think that like a modern day reader can draw from Sumner beyond just being interested in the period and interested in the
Yeah.
man? What kind of like lessons do you think can be drawn from Sumner's experience and from his like lifelong political work, really trying to
Yeah.
do something monumental, which is bring, you know, racial equality to the United States?
Yeah, I can think of two lessons. So the first lesson is the value and necessity of allyship with ordinary people. It's really striking to see Sumner develop this very close relationship of solidarity with the head of the House of Representatives mess hall, George Downing. I can't imagine there are many politicians in Washington today who not only know the name of the top chef in the Capitol Hill, but will actually go to that top chef for political advice
Yeah.
and will collaborate with that top chef on political strategy. Politicians will go to their consultants, they'll go to their donors, they'll go to major advocacy groups. They're very rarely going to ordinary people and taking their judgment seriously. Secondly, there's a real lesson of courage. Sumner in the 1850s, while he's seeing the anti-democratic threat in Kansas, while he is braving his own death threats, decides nevertheless to put his own life on the line to speak out against slavery and to speak in favor of American democracy. And I think there's a lesson there too about the need for courage in perilous times, the necessity for courage even in the face of death threats, the necessity of courage to stand up for American ideals and American democracy.
Zaakir, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the book. And yeah, this was great. This was really great, really informative. And for the Times interview, I'm not going to say you should buy the book, but anyone watching this, you should buy the book. You should get the book. Yeah. I'm of the belief that more Americans should know about this generation of lawmakers. You know, we're focused on Sumner here, but there's Daddy Stevens, there's John Bingham, there's Joshua Giddings, there's all these guys who are active in this period and who have a huge impact on what we understand the United States to be today. So I recommend the book. I think people should read it. And thank you for the time, Zaakir. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Jamel. You do amazing work, and you've done a great job of surfacing Reconstruction for ordinary readers and pointing out to them how important it is to our times now. And I couldn't agree more. So I really appreciate you putting me on.
Thank you.